Good morning. Welcome to this overview of the Highway Capacity Manual, 6th edition, coming sometime this summer. We're going to go through the next hour and a half and try to touch base on most of the high points for the changes that are coming technically to the 6th edition of the Capacity Manual. And I'll give you at least a brief overview at the end about what we're doing with the Highway Capacity software. If we have time, maybe a little demonstration. It just depends on how this goes. There's an awful lot of material to cover in a short amount of time. My name is Bill Sampson. I'm the director of the Highway Capacity, the McTrans Center at the University of Florida, and we're very involved in the Highway Capacity software development over the last almost 30 years now. So we try to keep up with what's happening in the Highway Capacity Manual, and been doing these training courses for a long time. This is going to be kind of a brief high-level overview, but I think I can get across to you what's coming in the manual, at least most of the details. We do offer a training course, and at the end I'll give you some details about that. You have my contact information there, both email and phone. If anything comes up after the webinar, please let me know. We're happy to try to help any way we can. In our webinar training, we handle things in the chat area. There's no audio or video coming from your end, but in the chat area, I'll notice a chat or a comment or a question. I'll try to address them as we go along. It is a large group, larger than typical, or it may be. We really don't have that many just yet, so I'll try to manage that as the best I can. If anything gets left over, we can handle it offline after the webinar today or later. So this is what we're going to try to do today. I know it looks like a lot, and I'm just going to try to go through an overview of the manual itself and what happened in HCM 2010 and what's coming in the 6th edition, and then go chapter by chapter, module by module, and just kind of hit the high points of what's coming in each of these chapters from an analysis perspective. And again, if we have time at the end, we'll look at the HCS. Even if we don't have time, I've got at least one slide that kind of shows you how we're planning to manage this in the HCS. We're very confident that we'll have it all done by the time the manual is produced, because we're kind of most of the way there now. So as you can see, this is just divided by chapter. We're going to start sort of easy and get more difficult and complicated as we go along, starting with the freeway segment chapters and modules, combining them to freeway facilities, and moving over into highways, 2-lane and multi-lane. And then we'll shift gears and go to intersections, looking at two-way stop control, always stop control, and roundabouts. Moving on into signalized intersections. We'll look at, I don't know if I have slides on the planning procedure, but I'll give you some hints about the planning procedures being interjected in the manual in the 6th edition. Then we'll combine signals into urban streets and urban street segments into facilities, including something called travel time reliability and ATDM, which also affects freeway facilities, and I think I probably have that both places. And then sort of at the end, maybe one of the biggest things coming to the 6th edition besides travel time reliability is alternative intersections, looking at modeling diverging diamond interchanges, displaced left turns, restricted crossing U-turn, and median U-turn intersections. Something that's sort of getting traction these days, especially DDIs. So that's the plan for the next little while. Even in our training courses, we focus on the HCM procedures. You would think that McTrans, being the developer of the software, would have you pull up software and just spend all the training course using the software, but we really don't. We spend 80+% of the time on the procedures, and then we sort of underscore how they're implemented in software. But by the time we get to the software, you're familiar with what the procedures do, the ideas, you know what to put in the little white boxes, you know what the report says. You're a much better analyst after understanding what's happening behind the scenes. And we've done this training course a few times now, and it's very important to look at the HCM 2010, because many big changes happened in the 2010 manual that sort of lay the foundation for what was able to be done in the 6th edition. The 6th edition was actually called an update to the HCM 2010 for a while, because We didn't realize it was quite as far-reaching until we continued to move forward on the committee and get the chapters sort of formulated and inserted, and so it became obvious that this is a significant change, and so it became a new edition. That picture of the manual, I have no idea what the manual is going to look like. I took the 2010 manual and photoshopped it a little bit so you could get the idea of 6th edition. It is going to be a new manual, so I gave us that feel. This in HCS6 going to release 7, kind of give you a sense for what that might look like. And again, each of these procedures that are being updated in the manual are going to be implemented in the highway capacity software. And as I said, we're well on our way. We've got most of the complicated things done, with one exception possibly. And I'll kind of give you a feel for that as we go along as well. So coming in the 6th edition, the organization will not change. It will still be 3 printed volumes with the 4th volume online. The major change organizationally will be example problems. In the 2010 manual, the example problems were in the printed volumes 2 and 3 in the methodological chapters. In the 6th edition, those example problems will be moved to volume 4, so they'll be in the companion, what are essentially appendices to chapters in volumes 2 and 3. And the example problems are moved out to make room for the added procedures and those steps and those procedures. Transportation Research Board limits the number of pages we get that print, and so that's the main reason the example problems are being shifted to the online PDF files. Distribution, I don't know. I'm not sure TRB knows, but I certainly don't know yet exactly how this is going to be managed. I don't know that owning the HCM 2010 will give you a price break on the 6th edition or not. I don't know that. I'm pretty certain you won't just be sent new pages, that the whole thing has been redone, so it'll be printed as a new edition. I don't know if there will be an electronic version made available. That's always been a bit of a wish from the users, but TRB has been reluctant to do that. So I just don't know if that's going to happen either. They told us at the annual meeting in January that this is likely to come in the summer. So as we move along in the spring and maybe in May or so, we'll start to see some of these plans finalized. Again, I'm not sure that TRB yet knows exactly the answer to all of these questions. Research, I always make the point that there was $5 million worth of research included in the HCM 2010 as compared with the HCM 2000. I don't know the dollar amount for HCM 2010 to 6th edition, but you're going to see a slide, probably the next slide, that talks about the projects, and the number of projects are essentially equivalent. So it does underscore the need for a 6th edition and not just what we were calling for a while an update. So we're going to go through each of the procedures and how they're implemented chapter by chapter. And again, if we get time, I'll show you a little bit about the software and our progress in implementing these, and maybe show you a couple of prototypes, again, time allowing. Sort of a quick history of the HCM. It came in 1950, was published by the Bureau of Public Roads, which is now called the Federal Highway Administration. A major change in 1965, but the first and second editions were really used for teaching in college, and they were traffic flow theory, and so, but really not put into practice. That all changed in 1985. 2 or 3 things happened in 1985. First, NCHRP, the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, and the Federal Highway Administration funded research up through leading up to the 1985 manual, and the Transportation Research Board sort of took this over. So that was a big change, so that some of the procedures were now based more on recent research and developed into deterministic models that we could go step by step and get a good answer at the end for each different intersection and roadway and highway and freeway type. But another big thing that happened then was this little thing called a personal computer. About the same time, PCs started landing on people's desks, And the first version of the highway capacity software was developed in about 1987. And you'll see a history of the HCS in just a moment. But combining those two things put the HCM procedures in practice. And probably one of the most far-reaching things in practice for transportation engineering and planning, because it could be used in planning, it could be used in design, it can be used in operations, it could be used in signal timing, it could be used in traffic impact studies. And so it really permeated many facets of our profession. And that's what makes it probably the most widely used manual, and certainly the most widely used software in our niche of the world. We had a major upgrades in 1994 and 1997, and then a new manual in the 2000. Completely reorganized, completely redone, lots of new procedures then as well. Then 10 years went by before the 2010 manual came out. Again, every time the manual was updated, it got bigger and it got more complicated, and that's true all the way until the 6th edition coming this summer. We're up to 37 chapters, and 4 or 5 models are not even documented in text. The only place you can see the actual steps is by reading Visual Basic Code in a spreadsheet implementation in a computational engine. So, but that complexity adds a lot more accuracy than we could do if we kept it simple. I like to brag a little bit on the folks that ran these 2 projects, because they did an incredible job. It's very difficult to manage all this information through 25 or 30 capacity committee members, all of whom we all think we're smarter than the other person in the room, so it's not easy to gain consensus. And all these drafts go back and forth through all of us, and lots of comments and suggestions, and ultimately somebody has to sort of boil it down so the committee can vote and it gets finalized. The 392 project that began in October 2007 was delivered to TRB at the end of 2010, published in the spring of 2011. The principal investigator was Mark Vandehayes, the CEO of Kittleson and Associates today. The 3115 project, also Kittleson project, John Zagier led this one. And again, everything delivered to TRB on time, and we're just waiting for it to be published sometime this summer. McTrans played a role in both of these projects, but probably a bigger role in the later one. We did a user feedback survey early on, and then developed training material toward the end last summer. So it's been interesting to be part of both of these. Yeah, here's that list of projects, and if you just kind of glance at it, you'll notice the HCM 2010 is right in the middle, and all the little blocks before then led up to the 2010, and the little blocks after that have come after 2010. So you see it's fairly equal. So the 2010 was a gigantic leap forward, I think, and I think a similar one, maybe not quite as practitioner related in the next one, and you'll see why as I go through these. I'm not gonna spend much time on any of these, but I want you to at least get the idea behind the research that changed the procedures and who did the work, or at least who the principal investigator was for each one of them. And so I'm just going to go one by one very quickly. The first one is interchange ramp terminals. This is the 2 signals at the base of ramps going on and off the freeway, and the unique interaction that those signals have with one another, and the methodology that was produced to model that interaction. That was Lily Eleftheriadou. She's a professor here at the University of Florida, and she's the chair of the capacity committee for about another week or 2. I think she rotates off in April, and it goes over to Tom Creasy, a consultant with Stantec in Lexington, Kentucky. HCM8G was an applications guide. This was early on. This was probably 2002 or 2003, and Peter Kuntz at Kittleson at the time managed this, developed 5 case studies, very detailed case studies to post on the web, the application guide. And the 6th one was developed toward the end of, right before 2010 to illustrate alternative tools that I'll talk about in just a moment. Roundabouts. Before the 2010 manual, there was no roundabout procedure that was based on U.S. conditions, and we couldn't get delay or level of service even on the one we had. And so Lee Rodigers was the investigator here and developed a procedure, very impressive procedure, I think. It's simple and accurate, and easy to understand, very logical, which is, I think, a key to some of these things, and based on U.S. conditions. And so we were able to compute delay and level of service for 1-lane, 2-lane roundabouts with bypass lanes, both yielding and non-yielding. So it's a big, big addition to the manual. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but Lee had trouble finding capacity roundabouts operating at capacity in the U.S. in 2006 and 7 when he was collecting the data for this, and that's changed. And you'll see one after the 2010 manual that is going to update those capacity models because more exists today. 370 is Urban Streets Multimodal. This is the first time the manual ever looked at the other modes. Now, we've always modeled the impact of a pedestrian or bicycle or even a bus at a signalized intersection, but the impact on the vehicle. We've always been modeling the vehicle. And so in the 2010 manual, now we can model the pedestrian level of service, bicyclist level of service, and the transit rider level of service, what their perspective is. So this is a wonderful tool for quantifying the effects of road diet or complete streets application. I'm surprised it doesn't seem to be getting as much use as I would have expected. This is Rick Dowling, a consultant out in Oakland, California, now part of Kittleson & Associates as well. Weaving, this procedure needed to be updated in the 2000 manual, and we knew that, and there was actually a project begun, and it fell apart for lots of different reasons, but finally the work got done for the 2010 manual. It's Roger Ross, a professor at Polytechnic University in New York City, that did this work and really changed weaving for the better. It went from regression analyses using parameters that you couldn't reproduce in the field. You had types A, B, and C, and constrained and unconstrained. This really wasn't as defendable as what he's done this time. They've got lane changing rates, and we checked capacity a couple of times, and the maximum length of a weaving segment is dynamic as it should be. So a big change. But what I always call the superstar of the 2010 manual is this next one, 379. It's Jim Bonison, a professor at Texas A&M at the time, and he added 4 things. I'll just give you 4. There are more than 4 things, but I'll give you the 4 big ones that changed how we model signalized intersections. The first one was NEMA. For the first time, the manual actually models a signal controller the way it actually works. Before the 2010 manual, we didn't know about NEMA phases and rings and barriers and the way the controller works, and now we do model it that way. So a big change and a necessary one. The second is phase duration model. Up until the 2010 manual, the actuated phases at a signal were not modeled as actuated phases. They were modeled as fixed time phases with a little tweak to the delay equation if you designated them as actuated phases. That wasn't a model, but now we do have a model that predicts the average phase time for each actuated phase over the multiple cycles in a 15-minute period. And we had never done that before, and that's necessary to convert saturation flow to capacity and to get that right. So another big change. And when you string together signals as urban streets, 2 other big changes. Flow profile was added. This models the platoon from the upstream signal to see what it looks like when it arrives downstream. That's very important to get the proportion of vehicles arriving on green. The better the coordination, the more arrive on green, the lower the delay. And if you don't get that right, then you're not modeling coordination very well. That arrival type was just a wild guess, and arrival type 3 or 4 is about all we ever used, and that was not very good. And that's been replaced now with the flow profile, a much better way to do that. And the last one I'll mention here is access points. If you've ever timed signals, you know that access points affects the speed and the integrity of that platoon that you're trying to get from signal A to signal B. And so modeling the effects of those access points on the platoon was also a gigantic change to the urban streets procedure. So 4 big changes to signals in urban streets, probably the most important thing that happened in 2010. 385 was alternative tools. This is Ken Courage at University of Florida, and what he did was he started with making a list of all the things the 2010 manual would not be able to do. And then he provided guidance on how you would model these things, these situations, using simulation or alternative tools, typically simulation. And the idea was, in the 2000 manual, it says if you don't compute delay, let's say, using the HCM procedure, you can't call that level of service. And so what Kim was trying to do was let's make the simulation HCM compliant, so the ultimate delay computation can be called level of service, and that's what he did for every chapter, I guess. Some had more advice than others. And then Mark Van de Hey was the lead of 392, getting the 2010 manual published. So let me go on to what's coming in 6th edition, Managed Lanes. This is Yen-Hai Wang, University of Washington, and for the first time we're looking at density within managed lanes, HOV lanes, HOT lanes, congestion pricing type situations for all 3 different segments in a freeway. And so this is a nice addition to what we do now. A lot of managed lane situations out there, we can now model them for 5 different flavors: continuous access, barrier with 1 and 2 lanes, and buffer with 1 and 2 lanes. So you'll see the picture of that later. Roundabout corridors. This did 2 things. It did really 3 things. It allows us to model an urban street where the boundary intersections are roundabouts instead of signals. So we can look at 3 or 4 roundabouts in a row and model as an urban street. I don't know how common that is, but we have one right here in Gainesville. We have 2nd Avenue downtown. They replaced 4 signals with 4 roundabouts, and so we can actually see that in practice here. In order to do that, the second thing had to be done, and they looked at geometric delay in a roundabout. We've always known geometric delay exists. We've always sort of ignored it in the analysis of an isolated roundabout. But this is being added to model the travel speed and the effects on including the effects of geometric delay at the roundabout along a roundabout corridor. Now, I'll probably say this again. You are in a corridor or not, and that'll be a policy decision of whether or not to compute it and to add it, but the ability to compute it is now there. And so that seems like the biggest thing, but really another thing happens here is the roundabout capacity equations are being upgraded. And it's for 2 reasons. The research did it because they found more roundabouts operating at capacity since the models were first created. And so that allowed them to update the capacity models themselves. And I believe a second thing happened. Research didn't look at this, but we got better roundabouts. I mean, 20 years ago, roundabouts were this foreign little object, and now we're better and better, and there are more and more places, and so drivers are driving them better. Both of those things lent themselves to the capacities increasing, and not just a little bit, 20 to 25% increase in capacity with these new models, and I'll illustrate the effects of that when we get to that chapter. It's a big effect. Work zone capacity. This is modeling work zones on a freeway. Jim Shane of Kittleson Associates out in Tucson did this work. And in the 2010 manual, there was a little bit of a discussion. There was one equation that was sort of subjective to model the effects on capacity of work zones on a freeway segment. And this one provides, you'll see, about a half a dozen equations that get more analytic in reducing capacity as a function of the barrier type and how far the barrier is from the lane, and the speed limit set in the work zone compared with the normal speed limit. Is it day or night? Is it urban or rural? And a lot of things that do have those effects. So again, a nice addition to the manual with all the work zones out there. 6th edition, again, that's John Zagier Kittleson, who pulled all this together in order to get it to TRB on time. Alternative intersection with the Federal Highway Administration from the Saxton Transportation Operations Lab. And this one looks at, you saw the list of those 4 alternative intersections, and those are going to be modeled in the new manual. And I like the fact that, especially DDIs that are being built all over the country, that the manual is sort of keeping pace in modeling DDIs, but at the same time looking at DLTs, used to be called continuous flow, R-cut, sometimes called super street, and MUT, sometimes called Michigan left. So it adds all 4 of those intersection types. They're kind of now where roundabouts were 20 years ago. They're just now kind of getting popular around the country, and so it's good that we're modeling them now. The SHARP 2 project, travel time reliability. This is a different way of looking at capacity and delay and density using something called a travel time index. The bottom line of this, and I'll explain it a little bit more later, is instead of looking at one 15-minute slice in time, which is what we do, we put in hourly volumes and a peak hour factor, or a 15-minute flow rate, and we use that to compute density and delay to get level of service on everything we do in the manual. This says, why not look at the whole year? Let's look at the distribution of traffic, the distribution of what happens weather-wise and incident-wise, and do we have special events and work zones, and create a distribution across the whole year or whatever time frame you want, and see what role that might play in making decisions. So again, a very different way of looking at things. I'm not quite sure how the world will accept it, but I'll give you an overview of the process as we get there. And then the new truck procedure. This is, if you're familiar with how we model trucks in the traffic stream, we generally create something called passenger car equivalence, and it's a function of percent trucks and the type of terrain. And up until now, up until the 6th edition, we split the trucks out into 2 categories: trucks and buses in one category, recreational vehicles in another category. And that's going to change. We're going to get a whole new set of passenger car equivalent tables. We're even implementing something called a mixed flow model, which I'll describe a little bit later. But now the trucks are going to be split into 2 categories: tractor trailers and single unit trucks. And single unit trucks will include buses and RVs and that rider rental truck that has 2 axles and that sort of truck. So I think a much better way to split out the trucks in the traffic stream, and we get a whole new set of passenger car equivalent tables and a mixed flow model that I'll talk about a little bit later. So kind of a quick overview of all the research that went into the 2010 manual and 6th edition coming. Again, the organization doesn't change. And again, this is not the cover of the manual. I don't know what it's going to look like. I'm just going to bounce through this quickly. Chapters 1 through 9 are just as they were. Lots of text interspersed and updated to address what's coming in the 6th edition, but structurally exactly the same. Volume 2, I've put in italics a couple of things that changed more dramatically here. Chapter 11 is added to show the travel time reliability procedure for freeways. That's Chapter 11. Chapter 12 I've italicized to draw attention to the fact that basic freeway segments and multilane highways have been combined into one chapter. Their procedures have always been very, very similar, and so that lent itself to put them together into one chapter. Weaving and merge and diverge 2-lane highways organizationally stays the same, and in fact, computationally, very little changes in those 3 chapters. On the interrupted side, we've added Chapter 17, again for the same reason, to implement travel time reliability along an urban street, just like we're doing on a freeway facility. The other chapters here are the same as they were, with procedures being changed as I'll go through. But I italicized 23 because that was the interchange ramp terminals chapter, and it's being expanded to include alternative intersections and diverging diamond interchanges, which is a big, big expansion of that chapter. So just drawing attention to the fact that one's going to change dramatically. And again, organizationally, this looks pretty much like it did before. I thought I had a list, but let me say one thing here. The chapters 25 through 35 are almost a one-for-one relationship with the chapters in volumes 2 and 3 to provide essentially appendices and now example problems for those analytical chapters. I'll draw your attention to 2 things here. This is a sample of 2 things the capacity manual cannot do and you must simulate to do, and you want to follow Ken Courage's advice to do it in an HCM compliant way. Now, before I forget about it, if you're using the highway capacity software, and you click on the little magic button that converts the HCS file to a CoreSim file, and then it runs CoreSim to generate an animation like you see in both of these slides. We don't just generate the CoreSim file number by number. We filter it through this alternative tool advice that Ken Courage wrote. So what that means is when you press that button in HCS and get a CoreSim file, it's already HCM compliant. And so if you're in another tool, you may have to change the internal parameters to match Courage's advice so that you can justify calling delay or density a level of service. But if you run HCS through course to generate the course in file, you don't have to do that. It's already been made alternative tool advice included. In the lower left, you see what we call left turn queue spillover. The green cars are going to turn left, and you see that the queue is longer than the storage. In the procedure, we compute something called a queue storage ratio. We compute the queue, the queue of the left turn, and the storage of the left turn bay is a user input value. If the queue storage ratio is greater than 1, that means the queue is longer than the storage, like you see in this picture. And it's pretty obvious, and every driver knows this, that left turn queue spillover affects the capacity of the adjacent through lanes. What I'm going to say here is that that effect on the adjacent through lanes is ignored in the capacity manual procedure. We compute the queue storage ratio, and if that's greater than 1, the highway capacity software will raise a big red flag and turn numbers red and do a bunch of stuff to draw that to your attention. But what it really means is the answers are wrong. The effect on the through movement there is not considered, and so that through movement capacity delay and level of service is incorrect, and you need to move that into simulation. A second example is an off-ramp where the signal queue backs up onto the freeway. That's another thing that is not modeled, and you have to take that into account and move on to simulation to get that one done. Now the good news, that one is being researched right now. There's a research project going on right now at the University of Florida, actually, with Lily Eleftheriadou, who's a professor here at McTrans, working with her software-wise to develop this procedures for modeling the effects of the queue. And the other direction, it could be that the freeway is congested and the on-ramp can't get on the freeway and the queue backs up to the signal at the on-ramp. So both will be modeled in this new procedure, but we're probably a couple of years away from that being in the manual. Very quickly about HCS. HCS, since the beginning in 1987, we have committed to keep the software exactly implementing the manual. And so we're very faithful to the manual, right or wrong, limited or unlimited. That's the reason we don't model queue spillovers, because the manual doesn't model queue spillover. So just underscoring that part, and we've been going to these committee meetings forever. Just every time the committee meets and they make a change, we tweak the software to implement that change, and you have to download and apply a patch. So the committee meets twice a year, and almost every single time they approve some change. And if a 3 gets changed to a 4, we got to change the 3 to a 4 in this code, rebuild the software, and that's one of the reasons you update the software at least a couple of times a year. So here's the history. Again, Polytechnic University created the HCS back in 1987 on an Apple IIe. You guys don't even know what that is probably. And then the Federal Highway Administration, who paid for that project, decided that IBM was going to beat Apple and had to convert it to DOS, and a lot of you don't know what that is. And so the DOS version was given to McTrans because that's about the time McTrans began in 1986. And they said, okay, we want you to sell it, we want you to fix the bugs, and we want you to provide technical support, and we want you to make it better. And so we've done that for going on 30 years now. Release 2 came out, and we took advantage of, while we were updating the procedures for the 94 update to the manual, we accommodated things like a color interface. Monitors were no longer just green and amber. This little thing called a mouse showed up. We put help in the software, even though engineers never read help. And in 1997, in our process of trying to implement the 1997 updates, we converted from DOS to Windows. We figured the Windows 95 had settled down and we could go ahead and go to Windows. It was a tough thing because it almost overwhelmed McTrans. You may not know this, but McTrans is 100% self-supporting. We don't get any money from the University of Florida or the feds or the state or anybody. We make all of our money from user buying software and paying for tech support and training courses. So when we almost spent all of our money before we got to Windows, that was a scary time. We got it done. We changed our model so that wouldn't happen again. 2000 manual came out. We were pretty much ready for that one. We're already in Windows. That was not a tough thing for us. We got tired of waiting for 10 years for the next manual, so we came out with HCS Plus in 2005, and that course M link that I described a moment ago was one of the biggest things we did. We added the ability to do signal warning analysis, a count tool for doing turn movement counts at intersections and doing them correctly to actually get arrival rate instead of the stop bar count, and some planning tools for Florida DOT that other states are starting to use. We added Transit F to both HCS and Course M in 2008. And then when the 2010 manual came out, we came out with HCS 2010, implementing all the things that I've already sort of mentioned. Many of them, you'll see them as we go along. And the 6th edition, we're well on our way to implementing all this. We have 3 of the 4 alternative intersections already done. We have travel time reliability in urban streets, and we're about to port that over into facilities. Work zones, managed lanes, tweaks to signals, a lot of these things are already in place. So right now I'm going to start chapter by chapter and just tell you what's coming. Kind of start easy and get harder as we go along. These are the uninterrupted flow chapters. I'm going to look at basic Freeway segments first. And every time I go into a new chapter, I'll show you what happened in 2010, bullet point level, and what's coming in the 6th edition. In 2010, the biggest change was that the free flow speed curves were no longer interpolated. If you had 67 miles per hour free flow speed, you pretended you had 65. If you had 68 miles per hour, you pretended you had 70. You went to the nearest 5 miles per hour. The base free flow speed that was 75 rural, 70 urban, that default was changed to 75.4 as a static number. Ramp density replaced interchange density in the free flow speed equation. Now in the 6th edition, notice, go to the next to the last bullet point where it says free flow speed no longer the nearest. We went back. We said, okay, let's no longer go to the nearest one. Let's continue to interpolate like we did before. So that was kind of a reversal of what happened in 2010. Managed lanes. For managed lanes, again, 5 different flavors: continuous access, buffer 1 and 2, barrier 1 and 2, creating a density estimate for the managed lanes themselves. And you'll see applications of that in not only basic Freeway segments, but weaving and ramps as well. Speeding capacity adjusted across all basic Freeway segments. You'll see a speed adjustment factor and a capacity adjustment factor for weather. The speed and capacity adjustment factors for driver population instead of adjusting the volume. And a capacity adjustment factor for incidents, and also the ability to calibrate for local conditions. So nice tools for the analysts if they want to model these areas. And these new truck procedures that I mentioned before are also implemented in the 6th edition. So this is what it looks like for the weather events. You get 8 or 10 weather events, and the speed adjustment factor is shown here for each of those weather events. Again, only if you want to model the effects of weather. Lots of times that's not something you're going to make decisions based on. I always talk about I-4 in Orlando in the summer. It rains at 3:47 every afternoon, quits at 4:30. So maybe they want to model this, but it's kind of up to you. Again, a similar set of adjustment factors to capacity this time for the effects of those same weather events. And what you'll see in the software is you'll be asked what weather event, and we'll implement these adjustment factors accordingly. A different adjustment factor to capacity for incidents, for lane closures. Now, when I first looked at this table, I thought, well, this isn't right, or well, what's different, what's changed? Because there's been this table kind of floating around traffic flow theory for decades that says, for instance, you close 1 lane out of 3, you don't lose 33% capacity, you lose half. Because drivers are affected more than just proportionally. You put an orange barrel out there, or you have an incident out there, it's not a proportional loss of capacity. It's 50% instead of 33% closing 1 lane out of 2. And then when I looked at this table, I thought, well, that's not what this says, but in reality, it is what this says. If you notice, it's applied to open lanes. I had to add that little thing that I just erased. So if you look at that same close 1 lane out of 3, that 0.74 is applied to 2 lanes. So 0.74 times 2 is about 1.5 lanes, which is half of 3. So it is very consistent with the theory that we've that we've used for many decades, just constructed a little differently. And if you look at the right, you can see that the picture of those 5 different flavors of managed lanes. And if you look at the bottom, you see the capacity, the basic capacity numbers of those managed lanes. And if you think about at 75 miles per hour, a general purpose lane has a stated capacity of 2,400. And in this case, it's somewhere between, I don't know, 1,700 and 2,100, depending on the design of the managed lanes. It's always going to be less. And if you have friction from the other lanes, it's going to be even more. It's going to be even more less, if that's a phrase. So you see the 5 different designs, and you see the capacity levels for each of those designs. Also, we're going to implement this new truck procedure, but I notice the bullet point here is driver population. So if you look down at the bottom right, that table provides another capacity and another speed adjustment factor for the effects on unfamiliar drivers in the traffic stream. Now what they did here is they changed it to speed and capacity adjustments instead of adjusting the flow rate. It used to be that a flow rate was adjusted by dividing by 0.85 up to 1, somewhere in that range, to up the flow rate. And they just decided to adjust capacity instead. And you see it's essentially the same range, 0.85 to 1, with a little description on where you might fall in that range, depending on the mix of drivers out there. On the lower left, you see the new equations for flow rate. Driver population factor is gone. And the new equation for heavy vehicles, the proportion heavy recreational vehicles and passenger car equipment for recreational vehicles is gone. And you'll see tables in a moment that give you these passenger car equivalents as a function of the split between single unit and tractor trailer trucks, as a function also of grade. Mountainous terrain was eliminated. That should have always been included in specific grade anyway. Let's see, do I have that? I don't. Let me say one other point here. The manual provides 3 different tables for a 30-70 split, a 50-50 split, and 70-30 split. And we talked with the researchers to be sure we could do this, and they said it would be good to interpolate linearly. So that's what we'll do. If you give us a 60-40 split in the software, we'll give you the appropriate number for that. The mixed flow model handles when passenger car equivalents aren't quite up to the task of modeling a whole lot of trucks going up a steep upgrade. And so when that happens, the speed flow curve itself actually changes and bends more rapidly, as you see in this graphic. So what'll happen is, as you get more trucks and steep upgrades, the passenger car equivalent model will shift over to the mixed flow model in order to more appropriately model the effects on the traffic stream from the speed flow relationship and therefore from the density relationship. Weaving. What happened in 2010, as I mentioned, was so dramatic. It changed almost the entire procedure. You can do one-sided, two-sided weave, left side weave, right side weave. You can do what the thing was based on is lane changing rates. How many lanes does the vehicle have to change in order to make the weave, and how many vehicles are doing that? That generated the rate. The maximum length was changed from a static 24,500, which could not be right. It had to be a function of weaving traffic and number of lanes. And so now there's a new equation to get that maximum length as a function of those 2 parameters. Weaving ratio was a simple turning movement thing. Capacity was computed 2 different ways, based on demand and based on density. And whichever was lower was compared to the flow rate to see if the VDC ratio was greater than 1. If the VDC ratio exceeded 1, you had level service F, and you had to go to freeway facilities to model that. So you had two checks, capacity and length, to make sure it still was a weave. And if it was, went on used the lane changing rates to generate the weaving intensity factor, which allowed us to compute the speed of the weaving vehicles and generate density. In the 6th edition, we incorporate those same speed adjustment and capacity adjustment factors for weather and incidents and driver population, and show I don't know if I have this on there. I do. I'll show you this managed lanes modeling the crossweave. Let me just describe that. You may have vehicles getting on an on-ramp and then weaving across the general purpose lanes to make their way to the managed lanes. That crossweave obviously reduces capacity, so that capacity reduction factor is shown at the middle of the slide to estimate that reduction in capacity. Now the manual didn't give me a graphic, so I flipped this one to show that this also occurs when you have vehicles leaving the managed lanes, weaving across the general purpose lanes to get to an off-ramp. So if you look real close, those arrows are pointing in the wrong direction. The text is a mirror image, and I just flipped this graphic. So if you squint, you get the idea. Merge and diverge. In the 2010 manual, ironically, the name of the chapter was changed, but almost nothing changed in the chapter. And in the 6th edition, not much changes here either. Again, to be consistent, capacity and speed are adjusted for weather, incidents, and driver population. There is one suggestion about managed lanes, and we added the ability to get density across all freeway lanes, even though density for level of service is within the influence area, which only includes 2 of the freeway lanes. Yeah, and here's your suggestion. If you've got a ramp coming on directly into the managed lane, you can model it by pretending, because the procedure won't allow you to have a 1-lane freeway. And I've been telling people for years, if you have a 1-lane freeway like a collective distributor road application, just double the volume and pretend you have 2 lanes. And that's exactly what they say for this situation you see here. If you're modeling the access to a 1-lane managed lane, you can double the volume and model it as if there were 2 lanes in the managed lane. This is how to get aggregate density across all lanes. Again, that's not for the level of service. That's done with just the volume in lanes 1 and 2 on the freeway. But for a freeway facilities application, you do need density across all lanes, and this describes how to do that and adds it to the merge and diverge segment chapter. Facilities, again, not a lot changed in 2010. It was added to be able to get a facility-wide level of service with a weighted average of the densities of each of the segments. The truck procedure managed lanes were as modified in the segment chapters are also modified in the facility chapter, as you might imagine. I'm going to show you the work zone equation, a nice addition. I'm going to talk about travel time reliability and calibration as well. So the work zone advice in the 2010 manual said that instead of 2,400, your capacity is about 1,600 plus or minus 10% based on a couple of things. That was really kind of subjective and not really a model. But what you see here, the parameters added in the 6th edition, where am I closing a lane or just a shoulder? Do I have a Jersey barrier or just cones? Is it an urban or rural area? What's the distance between the travel lane and the barrel? Are we operating at day or night? What's the work zone speed limit compared to normal speed limit and total ramp density? So all these things excuse me, are put together into a model that gives us a much better analytic to come up with what work zones do to our freeway traffic. I thought I was going to show you the equations, but I'm not. What ultimately is an equation to come up with a speed adjustment factor and a capacity adjustment factor for the effects of work zones on a freeway segment through a series of equations using these parameters as the basis. Let's see what I have here before I go too far. Okay, so let me spend a couple of minutes on this. This is kind of new to most people. Again, you start with a base data set that models the freeway facility for a single 15-minute period. You can actually do multiple period analysis, but we're talking about 4 or 5 15-minute periods in an afternoon, typically. So you create that data set. And then the next step here is, if you look at the lower right, you see this distribution of travel time index. In order to get that, you have to distribute the data. So instead of just modeling 5 to 5:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, which is appropriate if it's typical for what you typically do, we're going to expand that to model, let's say, 200 or 300 or 400 scenarios throughout a year. In order to do that, we have to vary demand. If your DOT probably has permanent counting stations, and they can tell you how 7 o'clock relates to 2 o'clock, how Tuesday relates to Friday, and how April relates to October. And so with those factors, you can come up with a distribution of demand for the entire year based on time of day, day of week, and month of year. The manual provides you with a weather distribution for about 200 cities, and you just pick the one closest to your freeway, and you're probably pretty close to what the weather does. So that distribution is provided. Incidents. If you have crash data, you can create the data set for your incidents. You can modify what's given in the manual. Then also you have the ability to model special events and work zones. Those are specific things that you know might be happening. Randomization means that we know how Tuesday relates to Friday, and we know that whether it's going to rain X number of days in a year or snow. And we know certain crashes happen and what kinds they are, but we don't know which Tuesday it's going to rain and which Wednesday and what time of day is going to be a crash. So that has to be randomized. So that's randomized to generate the 200 or 300 or 400 scenarios, and in those scenarios, the results of analyzing those scenarios is kind of melted together into a distribution. Computing something called travel time index. The travel time index distribution comes from the travel time for each of those scenarios as compared to free flow speed travel time. So as the actual travel time for Tuesday afternoon is 30% higher than the free flow travel time, then the travel time index is 1.3. How often that's above 1.33 develops something called a reliability rating, intended for you to be able to say, if I leave home and go to work, what are the chances it's going to take my typical 20 minutes, and what are the chances it's going to be something different? The more reliable, the more the user can depend on the roadway, and it remains to be seen how DOTs and folks will implement all this, but it's providing a lot of information for many different purposes probably. We can also model the effects of strategies that we might implement on those freeways. Dynamic message signs, managed lanes, variable speed limits, ramp meters, those kinds of things can be modeled as well as part of the active transportation demand management process. Multilane highways, the speed flow curves were not interpolated in 2010 and went back to interpolation in 2016. Bicycle level service was added. What happens in the 6th edition is that multilane highways are made more consistent with basic freeway segments. Instead of the EF threshold varying by free flow speed, which it did in 2010, it's going to be set to 45 for all free flow speeds. Instead of a 45 to 60 mile per hour range, that's going to be expanded to 45 to 70 mile per hour on a multilane highway. So two nice changes. Again, the passenger car equivalents are going to mimic those. We're going to use the same tables as basic freeway segment, all freeway segments use. So nice tweaks to multilane highways, but nothing dramatic. 2-lane highways, no changes. Significant changes in 2010, well, at least some changes. Class 3, a third class was added for moderately developed areas. Up until then, classes 1 and 2 were predominantly rural. The adjustments for grade and passenger car equivalents were modified structurally, not necessarily in their values. The two-way analysis that was the only way to do it in the 2000 manual. You had two different ways, two-way or single-way, to get passing lane effects in the 2010 manual. Now the two-way analysis will go away, or went away. Bicycle level service was added. In the 6th edition, nothing changes. The sensitivity analysis is added, but procedurally nothing changes. Now there is a project going on right now that will probably completely rewrite this chapter, but we're a year or two away from that finding its way in the manual as well. For interrupted flow, let's change gears now and look at the more complicated things, probably the more, well, not probably, we know the much more widely used chapters. And this is just to remind you, though, what those chapters are. Look at two-way stop control. What happened in 2010 are these, and I'll just go through them quickly. We've had them in place for 5 years now, I guess. The model 6 lanes on the major street, it used to be restricted to 4. On 4 lanes and 6 lane major roads, U-turns happen, and so those were added in 2010 to be able to model critical headway and follow-up headway for U-turns and conflicting flow relationships. Upstream signals. The upstream signal model before 2010 was sort of an independent model to a stop, but Urban Streets now creates this thing that I mentioned called flow profile, and the flow profile can generate something called proportion time block anywhere along the segment. And so now the upstream signal model was eliminated, and that proportion time block from the Urban Streets procedure was inserted in its place to model the effects of platooning from nearby signals on conflicting flow and therefore capacity at the stop control approach. We've always modeled the delay to rank 1 or throughs and rights on the major street caused by a left turning vehicle waiting to turn left and the through vehicle being behind him. That got expanded to say if you had a median opening where you had that could store 1 or 2 left turning vehicles, if a third one showed up and spilled over into the through lane, then that delay is created in 2010. 1 peak hour factor for the intersection was established for all interrupted flow, and so again here. What happens in the 6th edition is no changes whatsoever. The chapter number changes, but and I think there might be some tweaks to some paragraphs in there, but no functional changes in the 6th edition here. Same thing with always stop control. You can see at the bottom, no changes in 6th edition. What happened in 2010 were 3 lane approaches were added instead of limiting each approach to 2 lanes. And a queuing model was added to give you 95th percentile queue, similar to the way it's done in 2-way stop control. Now I'll just tell you software-wise, we have not implemented 3 lane approaches. We did implement the queuing model. So you can get the 95th percentile queue, but you can't get 3 lane approaches. We may never do this. Again, we're self-supporting. We have to pick and choose what we work on. And in 5 years, I've had about 5 calls. Gee, I need to model a 3 lane approach. And what I did was I said, send me your data. I ran it through the committee's computational engine and sent them their results. And until I get more than 1 call per year, I'll continue to do your job for you if you have a 3 lane approach, always stop control intersection. Roundabouts. Again, in 2010, this was changed dramatically. For the first time, delay and level of service, single lane roundabout, 2 lane roundabouts, single lane, 2 lane approaches, yielding and non-yielding bypass lanes. Delay and level of service, big advance in the roundabout world for the manual in 2010. What happens in the 6th edition are modified capacity models and roundabout corridors being modeled. Let me see what slides I have here. Yeah, here's the curve for the 2010 capacity models, and if you look at the equations on the left, you see they're based on 1130. So if there's no conflicting flow, the capacity is 1130, and if you look at the curve, that's where it tops out, and then it goes down as conflicting flow goes up. A single lane roundabout on the bottom, 2 lane roundabout for the 2 curves on the top. This is a big one now, pay attention. The 6th edition, that 1130 jumps by 20 or 25% depending on the lane configuration situation. That's a big change in capacity. And again, that's because the researchers now have more data. They know what it is more than they did 8 or 10 years ago. And drivers in the U.S. are getting more familiar and therefore more efficient at roundabouts. And both of those things drove these numbers up. So I'm just going to tell you, if you model a roundabout today, well, I'll give you an example. Example 1 out of the manual. Single lane roundabout. The intersection delay is 35.2 for level service E. If you put in these equations and model exactly the same data, the delay is 17.7 for level service C. So it's that level of change that these new equations are going to have. So if you have a roundabout that fails today, just wait a couple of months and it'll probably pass this summer. To model roundabouts along the corridor, in fact, I believe even isolated geometric delay is there. And so the data that you need is this inscribed circle. You see the arrow going up and down. The inscribed circle distance and the average lane width of the circulating lanes. If I know that, I can compute the central island diameter, I can compute the radius, I can get everything else I need. Let's see, do I show you the equations? I do. Good. If I know the radius, I can compute the circulating speed. That's really key to this whole expansion to the model for geometric delay. And so you see that first equation. The second equation is right out of urban streets. This gives you running time. The only thing that changes is the first term because you have a roundabout at the boundary instead of a signal, but the model is essentially the same. This is running time between intersections along a segment because we're trying to compute travel speed to get the level service of the segment. The next two equations show you geometric delay for subsegments. The segment is divided into two pieces, and geometric delay is computed for each of those two pieces, essentially based on free flow speed along the segment and circulating flow at the roundabout, and you kind of see that embedded in those two equations. But the bottom equation is very important. The delay to the through movement at the roundabout is not only the control delay that comes in the roundabout procedure, but geometric delay added to that to get the delay for the purposes of corridors. Now, whether you're on a corridor or not, if I approach a roundabout at 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm the only car out there, and I approach that roundabout at 40 miles per hour, I have to slow down to 15, navigate the radius around the circle, and then speed back up. So I do incur delay. And it's that geometric delay that exists whether it's part of a corridor or not, but the manual is going to say we're only going to compute it as part of a corridor. Now, if I was king of a DOT, I would probably include this even if I was looking at a roundabout all by itself. Up to you. Signalized intersections, again, what happened in 2010 took up the whole slide here, and I've mentioned a couple of these things, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. But again, we model controllers as they work. We model them based on NEMA to look at each phase independently and being consistent with the ring and barrier concept. Phase duration, looking at actuated phases, you know that in a 15-minute period you may have 10 cycles, and that left turn phase may serve a minimum one time, may go maximum one time, may get skipped one time, may go someplace in between one time. And to model delay, we have to know what that average green phase duration is for that phase. And so there's an iterative model that allows us to compute that, and that converts saturation flow to capacity. A little advice on base saturation flow from a population perspective was added. Above 250,000, use 1900. Below 250,000, 1750 is suggested, but I'm going to tell you, you really ought to calibrate this. Work zone adjustment saturation flow was actually added in 2010 manual. The D1 equation was changed a little bit to overcome the assumption that arrivals and departures were constant. They're not. And so D1 now recognizes that, and it's a little better estimate than it used to be. Pedestrian and bicycle level of service added to signalized intersections. What's coming in the 6th edition? A few pretty clever, good things here. Unsignalized movements. We call them free rights. Got a right turn movement that's not controlled by the signal, typically has a yield control at the end as it interfaces with the cross street. That has always been ignored. The manual says pretend the lane doesn't exist, pretend the right turns don't exist. And because the signal's not having to process it, so it did make sense. But if you want to model the effects on the intersection of adding that free right, then you have to include it in the average. And so the 6th edition allows you to do that. You have to compute that delay on your own, and I'll give you a little suggestion later on how that's done. But now at least we're modeling it. And that, again, is a very good thing when you're comparing intersection delay with a roundabout with a free right on a roundabout, a non-yielding right turn bypass lane. And that's done a lot these days, signal roundabout comparisons. And up until the summer, you're really comparing apples to oranges. One accounts for that non-yielding right turn bypass lane, and the signal does not. But that gets reconciled this summer. Saturation flow has always been adjusted for heavy vehicles and grade. There were two separate saturation flow adjustment factors, and they're going to be combined into one, and theoretically more accurate because there's research behind that. Work zones, again, that really happened in the 2010 manual, not in the 6th edition. I thought The factors were actually going to change, but they didn't. So what's already implemented in the manual and in the HCS will just remain. The effects on work zones. Essentially, 15% loss in capacity, even if you don't change the approach width or the number of lanes. And then it goes down from there. Auxiliary through lanes, lane distribution. If you have an auxiliary through lane where two lanes go through the intersection, they merge into one 200 or 300 feet downstream, drivers will consolidate in the continuous through lane and won't have as many cars in the auxiliary through lane because they know what's going to happen. So modeling that effect on lane distribution is now will be in the 6th edition, whereas now we kind of have to estimate that. Same adjustment saturation flow. This just gives you a basis for modeling that auxiliary through lane. The XMC value existed in the 2000 manual. We kind of broke it in 2010 because of shared lane permitted model, but it's being restored in the 6th edition, as is the planning method for signalized intersections. Part 1 will give you under, near, over capacity as a basis of free to V to C ratio, which I think is where we kind of should stop. The fact that you can get delay and level service at the planning level could be misleading, so be careful in using that. But it does allow you to go ahead and do that at the planning level with about 10% of the data. So just be careful on calling that level of service when it wasn't an operational procedure. So this just shows you the phasing, that the NEMA phasing that we're now following in the 2010 manual. I'll make a couple of comments here. You probably all know what this is about. But permitted lefts are not a NEMA thing. They are a controller cabinet thing. And so permitted lefts are modeled as well. You see east-west here is protected, permitted, north-south here is protected only. The other thing that NEMA doesn't really define that we do model are overlap rights. In other words, if I had a northbound right going in phase 1, I could model that northbound right independently of the northbound through. So that's why 18, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, 18 is defined independently of the through. So I can model that right turn overlap, which NEMA doesn't particularly define, but it's done all over the place. Phase duration model, I'm not going to get into this because we don't have time probably for it. Come back for the training course. But it looks at the 8 different phases and the cycle length and the red and the Q that's generated by the red to iterate to come up with a phase duration. For example, if I had a 100-second cycle length and I think my left turn phase is going to last 10 seconds, well, I can sort of iterate the C. That will give me 90 seconds of red. I know the incoming flow rate. I could estimate the Q from the 90 second of red and see if the green satisfies the Q. If it doesn't, I change the green and I iterate till the two match. I do that for all 8 phases, and that gives me the phase durations. The question about yield control. If you have a free right where a lane is added, then that is a free right and 0 delay is suggested. If you have a free right where there's a yield control, then you have to estimate the delay to that free right in other ways. It could be a two-way stop control modified analysis. If the acceleration, this is kind of a judgment call, if the acceleration lane is long enough where you're merging downstream and you're really not affecting the intersection at all, I think you would call that 0 delay at the intersection. But if you want, you can shoot me an email. I can see if I can find language in the manual to support that. But I believe that's what would be, that's how it would be modeled. So this phase duration model is quite complicated. Not only is it iterative, not only do we have to see how every one of the 8 phases affects the other, but it's not just green and red. You got startup loss time, you got clearance loss time, you got extension effective green, you got Q clearance time. Lots of pieces to each of these times. Well, very complex, computer-only sort of thing. Yeah, here's the free ride I'm talking about. Again, if that's a yield control at the base of that ramp, then you got to figure out what that delay is and insert that in the procedure. And those two equations show you that it's going to be modeled. It's going to be included in the approach and intersection averages as it should be. But the manual doesn't tell you how to do this. Again, if you have a lane addition, I believe you can justify 0 delay. If you have a lane addition that tapers and you're going up far enough downstream where at the signal, you really are getting zero delay. I think you'd still justified calling that zero delay. At the top, you see the heavy vehicle and grade adjustment factors as they exist in 2010. In the bottom, you see the way they're combined into one adjustment factor, but in two flavors, negative grade and non-negative grade. Work zones, this is what I thought was going to change. I saw some research that changed these three numbers, but that never made it into the manual. So what's implemented now will stay in the 6th edition. You see you lose 14 or 15% capacity just because the work zone exists. And if you reduce the number of lanes or you reduce the approach width, then that reduction gets to be even more. But headways change when you put orange barrels out there, and this is supporting that idea. Auxiliary through lanes, two views, so you kind of, I think most of you probably understand what this is. But I got a continuous through lane and an auxiliary through lane approaching and going through the signal. But if you look at the bottom, you see they merged downstream. Now the bottom actually has two continuous through lanes to show you that option as well. But the point is that the two through lanes at the signal, the lane distribution won't be 50-50. The traffic in the auxiliary through lane almost always will be less than the traffic in the continuous through lane, which means the capacity of that two-lane approach gets reduced because it's not equivalent, not relatively evenly distributed traffic. So how many we can process goes down. So they give you these two equations to estimate the flow rate in the auxiliary through lane and therefore the flow rate in the continuous through lane, and that allows us to compute essentially lane utilization factor based on the results of either of these two equations. Urban speed segments. Again, a lot happened in the 2010 manual. I'll just remind you, I think most of this already said. You got a flow profile replacing arrival type, a very, very important change. And so now we're estimating the proportion arriving on green correctly. The better the coordination, the better the flow profile, the better the proportion arriving on green. Mid-block access points, side streets, driveways affect the speed of the traffic. Think about driving down the road. You're going from signal A to signal B, and the car in front of you wants to turn into McDonald's. Well, instead of 47 miles an hour, you just drop down to 15 to let him turn. And you have to speed back up again. The average speed goes down. The integrity or how the platoon stays together gets broken apart. That's called decay. Modeling that's very important. And again, automobile, pedestrian, bicycle, and transit, all four modes modeled here, very effective for road diet, complete street comparisons. Flow balancing includes right turn on red. That's already implemented. We actually brought that up from McTrans. We implemented it in the HCS, and it's finding its way to be documented in the manual in the 6th edition. Free flow speed calculation gives you three changes, really. One, gives you a calibration adjustment factor, which I think you'll see in a moment. Models the effect of on-street parking between the signals, which has been ignored before. And the other one is it never lets the free flow speed get below the speed limit, which I think is a nice restriction. I mean, if it's signed for 45, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, rarely will you see somebody driving 44. So that's just recognized and implemented. Mid-segment lane blockage is modeled as an iterative procedure. I'm not sure if I have a slide on that, but it just restricts the saturation flow rates of the three contributing movements going to the segment. And because of lane blockage between the signals. The level of service table was restructured, and actually the threshold from A to B was changed. It was 85% travel speed as a percentage of free flow speed, base free flow speed in the 2010 manual, and it drops to 80% in the 6th edition. Yeah, there's a flow profile here. This just to make sure you understand what this is. This is modeling the platoon from signal A to signal B. This example is perfectly coordinated signal where that big gray bump is the through movement from the upstream signal. 100% of them arriving on green downstream. The little bump is the protected left from the side street upstream, going downstream as a platoon and arriving at the end of the green. And the little hump on the right is I'm turning right from the upstream signal. That's probably the next phase. It's not a platoon because I'm mixed with through and I arrive typically on the red. So it's this model that that takes us from a wild guess as a rival type to something very defendable in modeling the effects of coordination on signals. In the access points, again in the graphic on the right, you can see, just picture that platoon going downstream, and the more access points you have, the more delay and the lower the speed of the platoon, and they get broken up into pieces, and you can't accomplish what's shown in that graphic. A lot of those through movements spill over into the red because of the effect of the access points. I know that's a quick and dirty explanation, but that's the idea. Another graphic, I guess, showing you the effects on the integrity of the platoon and the speed caused by those access points, and then the arrival downstream on green changes, it gets worse. Nobody's ever modeled this before. This is the #1 reason signal timing people do fine tuning. And so now you put it in the HCS, and again, this has been in the HCS for 4 or 5 years, and fine tuning need really gets diminished. And these two things circled at the top are additions in the 6th edition, where a calibration, if you have field data and you want to calibrate base free flow speed to local conditions, you can do that. And a 4th term is added, or 5th term, I guess, for the effects of on-street parking. So you see the effects on, you see the speed constant, the median type, restricted median with or without curb, and access point per mile density affecting base free flow speed. Now we're adding on-street parking. And down at the bottom you see that the free flow speed can no longer go below the speed limit. Again, lane blockage is an iterative procedure. It really reduces saturation flow for the 3 movements contributing to the segment as a function of the restriction of capacity downstream. This is the restructured table, and I'll just make one point here. If you look at 50 mile per hour base free flow speed and the level service A row, you see that's 40 compared to 50, which is 80%. That used to be 85%. But if you look at the second one, 33.5 is 67% of 50, and in the 2010 manual that was 67%. So it's only the AB threshold that changes, and essentially the structure of the table. Urban street facilities, what happened in 2010 was we were able to get an overall level of service for the facility. 6th edition, what's added is sustained spillback. If you have a queue from one signal spilling all the way back to the queue to the upstream signal, the same iterative procedure that we use, or a similar procedure for mid-block lane closure, is used for sustained spillback. Travel time reliability, I'm not even going to talk about that. The process is identical to what I described for freeway facilities. It's just done for urban streets with a base urban street base data set and modeled on an urban street instead of a freeway. But the process, travel time index, reliability rating, all of that is the same. Weather and demand and incident variations. This is what, again, you can look at this also for the mid-block lane closure. You see how I got a lot of capacity to put traffic into this segment, but if I got sustained spillback, that capacity goes way down. It iterates until they match. Again, I'm not going to talk about this. It's identical to what I described for freeway facilities, just implemented on urban streets. I'm going to spend a few minutes on this. I've got signalized intersections at the base of the ramps coming off the freeway. This was implemented in 2010, and lane utilization was the main thing of this procedure. Turn radius, you can now model the effects on saturation flow as a function of radius, not just lefts and rights. A left turn default value is 112-foot radius, right turn is 32 feet, but you might have a skewed intersection, which is common for ramp terminals, and so that could be different depending on the radius of those turns. Lost time was additional lost time. Lost time is always when the light is green and traffic is not being processed. For demand starvation and queue spillback was implemented in interchange ramp terminals. This is the one chapter that does not give you an interchange level of service. You get level of service for a series of origin destination pairs instead, and I'm not sure why we don't consolidate that, but we don't. So this is the different flavors of interchange types. A diamond interchange on the lower left, the one in the middle is a single point urban interchange design, and on the right you see 6 different flavors of partial clover leaves, all with signals at the base. The unsignalized flavors of these are not modeled. And maybe 5 minutes or so on this, let me just show you. If you look at the top, I don't know if you've seen, I think I have a slide on each one of these so you get a little better look. But you get diverging diamond interchange on the top, and then 3 different intersection types below that. And let's see if I have a slide on each one of them. Yeah. This is, well, I guess I do. Let's see. No, I guess I don't. Let me back up and show this to you. I don't know if you're familiar with the DDI, but most of you probably are now. And what happens is the traffic moving this way crosses over and moves on the left side of the road through the interchange and crosses back over to the right side of the road here in both directions. And that's done so that the off-ramp can now interface with the lane that it's going to without having to cross over opposing traffic. The same for the on-ramp. If I want to get on, I can get on from this direction or that direction as a merge and not having to cross oncoming traffic. So it's a very, very clever increase in capacity without rebuilding the bridge. And that's the reason this is done. You think of interchanges, increasing capacity, adding lanes means rebuilding the bridge, which is very expensive. Here's a technique to add capacity without rebuilding the bridge. And so you see them popping up all over the place. A displaced left turn is if I'm coming this way on the minor street, I cross over the opposing traffic in advance of the intersection. So I get down here and I merge with the cross street and I don't have to go through the major intersection. This is signalized, and usually, typically, both of these are signalized as well. For R-cut, everybody on the side street turns right. If you want to go right, then you just keep going. If you want to go left, you make a U-turn and come back and go left. If you wanted to go through, you make a U-turn, come back and turn right and go through. So the side street really suffers, but if that allows the major street to improve, typically the traffic on the major street is going to far outweigh the traffic on the minor street, and the overall intersection improves. And a subset of that is a median U-turn. I can go through at the side street, but I cannot make a left. I have to go downstream, make a U-turn and come back. It's sometimes called a Michigan left. They've been doing it there forever. And so you've got these 4 flavors that are now modeled or will be modeled in the 6th edition. And one thing that happens here is something called extra distance travel time. So if I can't make a left at the intersection, I have to go down the road, make a U-turn and come back and go through, then I'm going an extra distance. And it's that travel time for going that extra distance that gets added to the delay to come up with what we now call experienced travel time. So for all 4 of these interchange and intersection types, we'll have experienced travel time to account for that extra distance traveled, as opposed to making the movement right at the intersection. For interchanges, because we're modeling these 2 signals, it's on a 120-second scale instead of an 80-second scale like signals. But for the alternative intersection, it stays the 80-second scale, even though the delay is going to go up dramatically for the side street because of the extra distance travel time. But the reason it stays at 80-second scale is so you can compare the alternative intersection with a conventional intersection on the same scale. So I think that makes sense to do. So diverging diamonds will use this scale up here, and the other 3 types will use the signalized intersection scale for level of service. So just a word or two. I probably won't have any time to demonstrate software here, but a word or two about what's going to happen. If you're familiar with HCS, the streets module now does signalized intersections, urban streets, and interchange ramp terminals. All are done within the same module of the software. What's going to happen with alternative intersections is that the same module is going to be used. You're going to check a box and you say, I want to do an R-cut intersection, and it's going to convert you're going to code it as a conventional intersection. It will convert the conventional intersection to essentially 3 intersections. The center intersection will be signalized, and the 2 downstream and upstream supplemental intersections will also be signalized. And so it creates a 3-signal pair, but it manages and it models them as 1 intersection, computing the delay at all 3 and then averaging them as is done in the procedure to get the overall delay for the distributed intersection, if you will, and comparing that to the 80-second scale. So it's that conversion that'll happen automatically by just clicking the button, and it'll show you. And if it's typically at an arc cut, it'll be signalized, and so the saturation flow will be adjusted for making that U-turn, and delay will be computed for both those supplemental intersections. For an MUT, the supplemental intersections are typically stop control. Instead of adjusting saturation flow, the critical headway and follow-up headway times will be changed as a function of the radius of that U-turn. So it allows you to do stop control or signalize for arc cuts or MUTs. Now DLTs typically will be signalized upstream and downstream. So without going into a lot of details, that's how it's going to be modeled. Now roundabouts, we've already changed the roundabout interface. If you've not downloaded 6.80, you probably should. The roundabout interface was upgraded into a different architecture as two-way stop control was done with 6.70, and as other modules will follow in release 7. But the procedure didn't change. So the roundabout's still the same procedure as existed in the 2010 manual. But we've already built the one for the 6th edition. And that's how I know that example problem 1 went from E to C with no data changing, just the capacity models changing. If you need to look at that, let me know. I can tell you how to do that even in the current module. You just change the critical and follow-up headway times to match what gets generated by those new capacity models, and you can see what will happen in the 6th edition already in the software if you'd like to see that. The Freeway Facilities module in the HCS is being completely rebuilt. It won't look and feel anything like the old one. It's going to be built from the ground up, and very likely all the segment modules will be built inside. So you run this one program, sort of like streets, and you say, do I want to do a basic freeway segment? Do I want to do a weave? Do I want to do a ramp? Or do I want to do a bunch of them together as a freeway facility? And you'll have all those choices to be able to manage it all in one chapter. Urban streets, we've already implemented the travel time reliability model. This whole idea of distribution of demand and weather and incidents, that's already implemented in urban streets, and we're working on the freeway facilities flavor of that now. So we're well on our way to doing all the biggest things that are coming in 6th edition. The one thing that's lingering for us right now is DDIs. And we still have a little ways to go in implementing DDIs, but again, that's underway, and we think we'll have that done probably in a month or two. So that's coming along as well. All these little things that I mentioned, you'll have access to capacity and speed adjustments. You'll pick among driver familiarity from a table. You'll pick weather events from a table. In reliability, you'll pick a city from a table of 200 cities to get the weather distribution from that city. Again, already implemented. You have new truck procedure, passenger car equivalent tables. So all this is already in place. We're just fine-tuning and testing for most of this. So what will happen from a software perspective is if you own HCS 2010 today and your support subscription is current, when HCS 7 gets released, it comes to you automatically at no charge. So as long as you support, and you want to do that now because the price for a new version of HCS is going to go up. So if for some reason your support is lagged or you haven't kept up with your support, you'll save significantly by getting that current before HCS 7 comes out, because once that happens, and we're not sure if that's going to be June or July or August, we can't release the software until the manual is released. So you want to get current now so that HCS 7 comes to you automatically and at no cost to implement all these procedures. So we'll be kind of waiting on the manual. We're not quite waiting yet because we're not quite done. But the manual they're telling us from TRB is likely to be mid to late summer. And so we think at the same time we'll be ready to release the software concurrently. So what I'll do now is I'll go ahead and close this down. I'll tell you that this is the way the training course looks. We do it in 8 90-minute sessions. The first 90-minute session is very similar to what you saw today. We do an overview of what's coming. And then we break it down, three 90-minute segments for signals, urban streets, ramp terminals, alternative intersections. And then the 5th one is on unsignalized intersections, two-way stop, always stop, and roundabouts. And then we do 2 on freeways to cover the segments and the facilities, and then 1 on highways at the end. Now we go through every step. This is as if you knew nothing, And this is not just the changes. We'll go through every step of every procedure so you understand them completely. That allows you to do them by hand if you choose to. The software will become much more familiar to you. You'll be a much better analyst, understanding all the equations and adjustments and advice that goes into modeling every one of these if you want to do the full training course. And right now, the last 2 weeks of May or the second, I think the second and third week of June are tentative dates. We don't know them exactly, but probably in the next couple of weeks we'll make a decision, put something on the website. So if that's something you're interested in doing, just kind of check our website, shoot me an email. Be glad to answer that as we move along. So just to remind you very quickly of my email address and phone number, please call me or email me if something comes up in the next 10 minutes or in the next year. Anytime you have a question related to HCM or HCS, please feel free to give us a call, send us an email. If you're analyzing something and you want advice or you want help, please send the data file. So that's probably all I have. It's right at noon. I'm going to shut us down for today. And please let me know if I can help in any way as this starts to be rolled out, or even as you're doing things in the 2010 version. I appreciate you all attending and listening, and look forward to helping you out along the way, and especially when HCM7 comes out in conjunction with the HCM6 edition. Again, thanks for coming, and please let me know if I can help down the way. Thank you.